Walls against chaos, the birth of the dragon's spine. It is the largest man-made structure ever built, a colossal chain of fortifications stretching thousands of miles across mountains, deserts, and plains. A testament to human ambition and fear. It is the Great Wall of China, a misleading name for what is, in truth, a collection of walls built by different dynasties over 2 millennia. Our story begins not with a single empire, but with the chaos that preceded it. The Warring States period, c. 475–221 BC. Before China was unified, its various powerful kingdoms, such as Qi, Yan, and Zhao, were locked in endless internal conflict. Each of these states began building its own segmented defensive walls, primarily out of packed earth and stone, to protect their borders from each other. These were the very first Great Walls, short isolated barriers of defense against neighboring Chinese armies. However, the true unified purpose of the wall emerged with the arrival of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, pronounced Qin Shi Huang. Having ruthlessly conquered all the rival states by 221 BC, he unified China for the first time. He commanded uniformity in weights, measures, currency, and even the width of cart axles. But his greatest unifying project was military. Qin Shi Huang recognized that the primary, external threat to his fledgling empire did not come from the south or the east, but from the restless, fierce nomadic tribes on the northern steppes, collectively known as the Xiongnu. The emperor's vision was grand: to connect the scattered defensive walls of the former kingdoms and expand them into one continuous imperial border, a single, massive barrier against the Xiongnu threat. He tasked his most trusted general Meng Tian with overseeing this monumental project. General Meng Tian was given a massive army and vast resources. The project required the labor of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, convicted criminals, and impressed peasants. They were forced to work under brutal, unrelenting conditions, often in extremely remote and harsh environments. The human cost was staggering. It is commonly said that every stone of the early wall cost a life. The early Qin wall was a military border, designed to be a clear line in the sand, a statement that civilization ended here and the barbarian lands began. Its purpose was not just to keep invaders out, but to project imperial power, secure the trade routes, and, most importantly, prevent the Xiongnu cavalry from raiding and quickly escaping back into the steppes with their loot. However, the Qin dynasty itself was short-lived, collapsing just a few years after Qin Shi Huang's death. But the essential idea, a colossal northern defense, had been permanently etched into the Chinese imperial psyche. The foundation for the most iconic structure in world history had been laid, now destined to be rebuilt, expanded, and defended by every major dynasty for the next 1,500 years. Expansion and the Silk Road, the wall under the Han Dynasty. The collapse of the short-lived Qin dynasty in 206 BC brought the harsh realities of constant northern warfare back to the forefront. The Xiongnu nomads, no longer facing the iron will of Qin Shi Huang, grew bolder and more unified, pressuring the newly established Han Dynasty. The Han emperors, particularly Emperor Wu, recognized that a strong northern defense was essential not just for security, but for economic survival. Initially, the Han Dynasty attempted diplomacy, offering tribute and royal marriages to the Xiongnu in exchange for peace. This policy proved costly and often ineffective. By the reign of Emperor Wu, 141–87 BC, the strategy shifted dramatically to aggressive military expansion and, crucially, massive wall construction. Emperor Wu's primary goal was to secure and expand the lucrative Silk Road. This network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia and the West was vital for the dynasty's wealth and prestige. However, the Silk Road ran perilously close to the Xiongnu territories. To protect this economic lifeline, the Han embarked on their own monumental wall project, extending the existing Qin foundations far to the west into the treacherous Gobi Desert. This expansion was unique. Instead of massive stone structures, the Han primarily utilized the local materials, layers of tamped earth, gravel, and sometimes reeds or branches, building walls and watchtowers that were adapted to the arid, sandy environment. The most iconic structure of this Han expansion was the series of Zhuquan and Dunhuang fortifications. The Han walls stretched deep into the Hexi corridor, creating a protected passageway for silk merchants, emissaries, and military garrisons. The thousands of watchtowers and beacon towers built along this western extension were the critical component. These towers, often spaced less than a mile apart, served as an ancient communication network. A standardized system of signal fires and smoke columns allowed for rapid communication. A single column of smoke might signal a small raiding party, while multiple smoke signals could warn the central command of a major invasion within hours. This early warning system was arguably more important than the physical barrier itself. The Han Dynasty's wall was therefore not just a passive defense, it was an active tool of imperial policy. It facilitated the flow of goods and culture across Eurasia, defined the limits of Chinese political control, and allowed the Han to project power over the restless Central Asian tribes. By the end of the Han Dynasty, the Great Wall reached its greatest geographical extent to the west. While the Qin Wall was built out of desperation and centralized tyranny, the Han Wall was built for economic expansion and strategic control over trade. However, once the Han Dynasty itself began to crumble in the 3rd century AD, the wall, like the empire it defended, began to fall into disrepair. The Great Dragon's spine was left largely unattended for centuries, waiting for the next great dynasty to rediscover its necessity. The Dark Ages, fragmentation, and the wall's neglect. The period following the collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220 AD, often called China's Dark Ages, was one of profound fragmentation and chaos. For over 3 centuries, China was divided among competing dynasties and kingdoms. The once unified empire fractured, and with that fragmentation, the centralized maintenance of the vast northern defenses ceased. During this time, the Great Wall suffered its greatest period of neglect. The tamped earth sections built by the Han in the deserts were eroded by wind and rain. Stone sections fell into ruin. Why? Because the various kingdoms now occupying North China were often ruled by non-Chinese groups who had breached the wall in the first place, or they were simply too preoccupied with internal wars to worry about a distant, deteriorating barrier. Yet even in fragmentation, the concept of the wall persisted. Several short-lived dynasties, most notably the Northern Qi, 550-577 AD, and the Northern Zhou, 575-81 AD, briefly undertook massive repair and rebuilding projects. These were desperate attempts to secure their own small northern frontiers against rising nomadic threats, such as the Gök Turks. The rebuilding by the Northern Qi was particularly intense. They forced entire populations into labor, constructing hundreds of miles of new, often shorter but stronger walls near the modern-day provinces of Shaanxi and Hebei. They understood the ancient function of the wall, to keep pastoral nomads separate from the sedentary agricultural civilization of the Central Plains. These small localized projects demonstrated a key truth about the Great Wall. It was not a monument, but a dynamic military system that reflected the health of the central government. When the government was strong, the wall was strong. When the government was weak or divided, the wall became obsolete and crumbled back into the earth. The most crucial factor during this era was the Sinicization, becoming Chinese, of the northern barbarian rulers. Many of the nomadic groups who established dynasties in North China gradually adopted Chinese language, bureaucracy, and culture. They began to see the wall not as a symbol of their oppression, but as a necessary defense for their newly adopted Chinese state against the nomads still outside the borders. The cycle of construction, neglect, and rediscovery defined the centuries until the rise of the next great unified dynasty, the Sui and Tang, starting 581 AD. These dynasties finally reunified China, and while the early Tang initially chose diplomacy and offensive campaigns over wall building, the precedent was set. The wall was a dormant promise, waiting for the moment when a dynasty felt threatened enough to invest in it again on a truly imperial scale. Failure and rebirth. The Mongols, the wall's demise, and the Ming reaction. The centuries following the Tang dynasty were defined by the colossal threat that the wall was originally intended to stop, but failed to contain: the Mongols. In the 13th century, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the unified Mongol hordes became the single most destructive military force the world had ever seen. The old fragmented remnants of the Great Wall proved utterly useless against their mobility and power. The Mongols did not need to conquer the wall, they simply bypassed or ignored it. They moved swiftly across the steppes, finding the gaps and unguarded passes, overwhelming China's defenses, and ultimately conquering the entire country, establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271 AD. This period of Mongol rule was a harsh lesson for the Chinese. When the nomads ruled the north, the wall was completely abandoned. Why build a defense against yourself? The lesson learned was that walls alone cannot save an empire. Only a strong central government can. The Mongol rule was overthrown in 1368 AD by the Han Chinese uprising that founded the Ming Dynasty. The Ming founders were driven by a powerful desire to purge China of foreign influence and reassert traditional Han civilization. Central to this mission was the absolute necessity of defending the northern frontier against the deposed but still powerful Mongol remnants. The Ming emperors looked back at 2 millennia of failed defenses and realized a fundamental truth. The earth walls and segmented barriers of the past were insufficient. If the wall was to be rebuilt, it had to be permanent, comprehensive, and impregnable. Thus began the Great Wall's golden age of construction. Starting in the late 14th century, the Ming Dynasty launched the most extensive and rigorous building project in the wall's history. Unlike the Han, the Ming utilized high-quality materials, kiln-fired bricks and stone, which offered superior durability and required complex organizational logistics. This new Ming wall was not a continuous single line, but a multi-layered, heavily garrisoned defensive system. It featured robust watchtowers, large fortresses, and permanent garrisons positioned along the most vulnerable mountainous routes. It was built with a specific purpose, not just to block, but to signal, garrison, and defend against cavalry raids, preventing them from ever reaching the fertile heartland. The construction methods used by the Ming Dynasty are what most people recognize today as the iconic image of the Great Wall, a masterpiece of stone and brick weaving across the rugged landscape. It was a massive financial and human sacrifice, but for the Ming, it was the only guarantee against a repeat of the Mongol devastation. The Ming masterpiece, brick, stone, and strategic design. The Ming Dynasty's rebuilding of the Great Wall was an engineering feat unparalleled in scale and complexity since the time of the pyramids. This wasn't merely rebuilding, it was a total upgrade of the northern defense system, integrating advanced building materials and innovative strategic design. The defining characteristic of the Ming Wall is the material, high-quality kiln-fired bricks and finely cut stone blocks. The earlier Han and Qin sections used tamped earth which disintegrated easily. The Ming understood that only fire-hardened brick could withstand the harsh weather, erosion, and most importantly, the impact of siege weapons over time. Transporting these materials was a logistical nightmare. In mountainous terrain, bricks and stone blocks, often weighing hundreds of pounds, were hauled up slopes using simple human labor, donkeys, goats, and ingenious gravity-powered rope systems. The massive resource drain demanded a permanent, state-managed bureaucracy, showcasing the robust administrative capabilities of the Ming state. Beyond the materials, the Ming Wall was designed as a sophisticated military platform. The wall walk was wide enough for troops to march in formation and allowed for the swift movement of cannons and supplies. The design deliberately incorporated complex features. Firstly, watchtowers. These were not just lookouts, they were multi-story barracks and armories. Each tower housed a small garrison and stored food, water, and weapons, allowing them to hold out for extended periods during a siege. Their height gave archers and later gunners a crucial advantage over attacking forces. Secondly, beacon towers. Separated from the wall itself or placed on the highest peaks, these towers were the communication grid. Using carefully calibrated combinations of smoke, day, and fire, night, signals could travel hundreds of miles in just a few hours, alerting garrisons and summoning reinforcements from the capital. Thirdly, fortresses and gates. At key strategic passes such as Shanhaiguan, the old Dragon's Head on the coast, or Jiayuguan in the far west, the wall expanded into massive fortified cities designed to be the main defensive strongholds. These gates were bottlenecks, funneling invaders into kill zones and acting as the administrative headquarters for entire defensive sectors. The Ming Wall was the perfect embodiment of defensive doctrine. It did not rely on the height of the barrier alone, but on the speed of communication and the density of the fighting force it could project from its numerous towers and platforms. It was a linear city of war, a standing army cast in stone. This colossal project was not finished quickly. It spanned 2 centuries of continuous building and repair, a monumental effort that reflected the Ming dynasty's obsession with northern security, an obsession tragically fueled by their fear of the Mongol return. Life on the Dragon's Back, soldiers, settlers, and the frontier. The Great Wall was far more than a pile of stone and brick. It was a living, breathing military frontier, a unique ecosystem where the harsh realities of defense shaped the lives of millions. Life on the wall was defined by isolation and duty. The garrison stationed in the thousands of watchtowers and fortresses were often composed of soldiers sent from the heartland, serving mandatory, lengthy terms. Their days were monotonous. Constant patrols, maintenance of the walls and beacon fires, and the endless vigilance against raiding parties. The conditions were brutal. Soldiers faced extreme climates from blistering summer heat to freezing, lethal winters in the high mountains. Supplies were perpetually difficult to transport, leading to reliance on locally grown food and water stored in reservoirs. Discipline was strict. Any dereliction of duty, particularly failure to light a beacon fire during an attack, could be punishable by death. However, the wall was not just a military line, it was a frontier. Behind the main fortifications, the Ming government often encouraged military agricultural settlements, Tuntian. Soldiers and their families were given land to farm, essentially becoming self-sufficient garrison farmers. This system minimized the cost of transporting food from the interior and ensured a permanent localized population loyal to the Ming state. These settlements created a distinct frontier culture. They were the meeting point, and often the violent collision point between Han Chinese civilization and the nomadic world. Despite the military conflict, trade and cultural exchange often flourished in the spaces near the heavily guarded gate towns. Nomads would bring horses, furs, and livestock to designated market areas, trading them for Chinese tea, silk, and iron tools. These exchanges were vital to both sides. The Chinese relied on the superior northern horses for cavalry, and the nomads relied on manufactured goods from the south. The wall ironically became a regulated funnel for the very interaction it was built to restrict. The primary enemy of the Ming, the Mongols, were not a monolithic group. Many tribes, known as the tame Mongols, were allowed to settle just inside the wall, provided they served as auxiliary troops for the Ming, a dangerous, calculated gamble of employing yesterday's enemy to fight today's threat. The psychological impact of the wall on the Chinese imagination was profound. It represented the edge of civilization, the line that protected order from chaos. For the soldiers and settlers who spent their lives there, the wall was a relentless, demanding master, a monumental commitment that defined their existence and the security of the entire nation. The Great Betrayal, Shanhaiguan, and the Manchurian Breach. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Ming dynasty was facing terminal decline. Internal corruption, peasant revolts fueled by famine, and a crippling financial crisis had drained the treasury and starved the northern garrisons. Simultaneously, a new, formidable threat emerged beyond the wall's easternmost terminus, the Manchus. The Manchus, a semi-nomadic people from Manchuria, northeast of China, were meticulously organized and highly militarized. Unlike the Mongols who sought to bypass the wall, the Manchus focused their strategic efforts on penetrating it, particularly at the most critical points. The most vital defensive position in the entire Ming system was the fortress of Shanhaiguan, known as the First Pass Under Heaven. This massive structure sat exactly where the Great Wall met the sea on the Bohai Gulf, securing the narrow coastal passage that was the easiest route from Manchuria into the fertile North China plain. As long as Shanhaiguan held, the Ming capital of Beijing was safe. The Ming general in charge of this critical defense was Wu Sangui. He was perhaps the last true military titan loyal to the dynasty, commanding the finest remaining Ming troops, the ones trained and seasoned by decades of frontier warfare. The inevitable crisis came in 1644 AD, while Wu Sangui was busy defending Shanhaiguan against the Manchus. A massive peasant rebellion led by Li Zicheng erupted in the interior, sweeping through the capital and forcing the last Ming emperor to commit suicide. With Beijing fallen and the Ming dynasty technically over, General Wu Sangui faced an impossible dilemma. 1. Surrender to the peasant rebels who had killed his emperor and seized his family's property. Ally with the Manchus, his lifelong external enemy, to crush the internal rebellion and restore order and the Ming dynasty. Wusongui chose the latter. He opened the gates of Shanhaiguan and allowed the massive Manchu army, led by the regent Dorgon, to pour through the wall and into China proper. The barrier that had cost millions of lives and centuries of wealth, the colossal defense against the northern barbarians, was not conquered by force. It was deliberately opened through a calculated political decision. The Manchu forces quickly crushed the peasant rebellion, and instead of restoring the Ming, installed their own dynasty, the Qing. Ironically, the Great Wall had failed not because of an architectural flaw, but because of a political and military collapse behind the lines. The opening of Shanhaiguan remains the most potent symbol of the wall's ultimate failure to protect the Chinese nation from northern invaders, marking the end of the Han Chinese rule and the beginning of the Qing Dynasty, the final imperial chapter of China. The Great Wall under the Qing, a relic of the past, with the Manchus establishing the Qing Dynasty, 1644–1912 AD. The very purpose and strategic value of the Great Wall fundamentally changed. The Manchus, who had successfully breached the wall to conquer China, now ruled the entire territory on both sides of the barrier. For the first time in centuries, the primary enemy, the nomads of the north, were no longer external threats. They were either subjects of the Qing Empire or allies. The Mongol tribes, the traditional adversaries the wall was built to exclude, were integrated into the vast new Manchu Empire through a careful system of alliances, treaties, and military force. Under the Qing, the wall ceased to be the critical line of defense. The new strategy was to control the steppe through direct military administration and diplomacy, rather than relying on static fortifications. They maintained control over the passes, but extensive repairs and continuous construction largely ceased. In fact, the Qing saw the wall as somewhat of an embarrassment, a monument to the weakness and paranoia of the deposed Ming dynasty. For centuries, the Ming had been obsessed with closing the north, while the Qing had proved that true security lay in conquering and controlling it. The Qing emperors adopted a policy known as the Willow Palisade, a different type of wooden barrier constructed further east in Manchuria. Its purpose was not to keep enemies out, but to restrict Han Chinese migration into the ancestral Manchu homeland, effectively protecting the Manchu cultural core from Sinicization. This was a clear reversal of the wall's original function. As the centuries passed under Qing rule, the Great Wall began a second, prolonged period of neglect. Stone and bricks were often taken by local villagers to build homes, wells, and field terraces. The wall was no longer a military line. It was simply a quarry and a relic, slowly dissolving back into the landscape. Many sections fell into complete ruin, overgrown by vegetation and forgotten by the central government. However, the political and psychological importance of the wall remained. The passes and gatehouses, such as Juyong Pass, were often maintained as symbolic markers and centers for collecting customs duties on internal trade. While its military role faded, the wall became a powerful cultural symbol, a physical representation of the long, often violent history between the Chinese agricultural world and the northern nomadic empires. It stood not as a successful military barrier, but as the enduring memory of the Ming's defiance. Myth and legend, the wall in the Western and Chinese imagination. As the Great Wall's military function declined under the Qing dynasty, its power as a cultural symbol soared, particularly in the minds of foreigners and eventually in the renewed national identity of the Chinese people. For centuries, the wall existed only as a concept in the West, a legendary barrier marking the edge of a mysterious Eastern empire. European visitors and missionaries during the Ming and Qing periods brought back fantastic tales of its scale, cementing its image as a structure of mythic proportions. This fascination fueled the widely circulated, though entirely false, myth that the Great Wall is the only man-made structure visible from the moon or even from low Earth orbit with the naked eye. This idea is a 20th century falsehood, yet it vividly captures the immense scale the wall held in the global imagination. Within China itself, the wall occupied a more complex, often darker cultural space. It was not merely a symbol of national strength, but also a haunting reminder of the immense human cost of its construction. The wall became known as the longest cemetery on Earth, due to the millions of laborers, soldiers, and convicts who perished during the Qin and Ming construction periods and whose bodies were often interred within the wall itself. This somber legacy gave rise to one of China's most enduring folk tales, the legend of Meng Jiangnu. In this popular story, a peasant woman named Meng Jiangnu travels a vast distance to bring winter clothes to her husband, who was forcibly conscripted to build the wall. When she arrives, she learns her husband has died from exhaustion, and his body is entombed within the structure. Her tears fall so heavily that a section of the wall collapses, exposing his bones. The legend is a powerful indictment of the cruel imperial forced labor and the immense suffering behind the monumental achievement. In the early 20th century, following the collapse of the Qing Dynasty, the wall's symbolism was repurposed. As China entered a period of civil war and foreign invasion, the Great Wall was no longer seen as a symbol of failure or oppression, but as a stirring testament to the nation's enduring spirit and resilience. It became a powerful rallying point, a physical representation of the Chinese people's resolve to defend their civilization. This shift set the stage for the wall's final transformation in the modern era. From a dilapidated relic of military strategy to a carefully preserved national icon and one of the world's most recognizable landmarks, awaiting its final legacy in the 20th and 21st centuries. Modernity, preservation, and the enduring legacy. Following the 1911 revolution and the subsequent decades of turmoil, the Great Wall found a new, vital role in the national identity of the modern Chinese state. No longer a military barrier, it became a symbol of Chinese ingenuity, continuity, and perseverance. In the 1980s, driven by an increasing awareness of its monumental historical value, the Chinese government launched extensive efforts to preserve and restore the structure. Significant accessible sections like Badaling and Mutianyu near Beijing were meticulously restored to their Ming-era glory, primarily for tourism. In 1987, the Great Wall was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, officially recognizing its universal significance. Today, it is arguably the most famous and widely visited historical site in the world. However, the sheer scale of the wall presents monumental preservation challenges. Despite its fame, the vast majority of the structure, particularly the older earth and gravel sections built by the Qin and Han dynasties, remains untouched and continues to rapidly deteriorate due to natural erosion, agricultural encroachment, and vandalism. Estimates suggest that perhaps less than 10% of the wall is in good condition, while 1/3 has completely vanished. The wall's legacy today is a study in contradictions. 1. A symbol of isolation. It represents the centuries-long policy of closing China off from the outside world, yet today, it welcomes millions of international tourists every year. 2. A military failure. It failed spectacularly to stop the Mongols and the Manchus, yet it remains the most potent global symbol of Chinese strength and resilience. For an architectural marvel, it stands as an undeniable feat of engineering, achieved not through advanced technology but through sheer organizational power and relentless human labor, a monument built on both genius and immense suffering. The Great Wall, in its thousands of miles of stone, brick, and crumbling earth, is the ultimate physical representation of the entire arc of Chinese imperial history. It tells the story of early fragmentation, unifying ambition, strategic necessity, political failure, cultural preservation, and modern renaissance. The dragon's spine endures, a silent, colossal witness to 2 millennia of history, reminding the world that some human endeavors are so vast, they transcend their original purpose and become a part of the earth itself.